The night passed slowly, and I kept my distance. The next day, when I dared to venture closer, I saw that the men had left. Their campfire was extinguished, and the jungle was silent again. I ventured out cautiously, making sure not to leave any tracks behind. The encounter had left me shaken, and I knew I had to be more careful from now on. For days, I stayed close to my shelter, wary of any more visitors. But the memory of the strange men lingered in my mind. Who were they? What did they want? And what did my future hold on this desolate island? I forced myself to continue my daily survival routine, gathering food, tending to my goats, and reinforcing my shelter. But I was no longer at ease. Every sound in the jungle made me tense. I imagined eyes watching me from the shadows, hidden figures tracking my every move. At night, I barely slept, listening for footsteps, waiting for the return of those men. One evening, as I sat by my fire, I made a decision. I could not spend my days living in fear. If these men had been on the island before, they would return. I needed to be prepared. The next morning, I set out to explore the area where they had camped. I moved cautiously, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. When I reached the site, I examined everything closely. The fire pit was cold, its ashes scattered. Bones lay nearby, charred by the flames. A deep unease settled in my chest. These were not animal bones. A horrible realization struck me. These men were not just visitors, they were cannibals. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, glancing around as fear tightened its grip on me. This was worse than I had imagined. They were not lost travelers or peaceful natives. They were dangerous, ruthless, and they would return. I turned and hurried back to my shelter, my heart pounding. My safe island had become a prison, a hunting ground where I was now the prey. From that moment on, I became more cautious. I stopped lighting fires at night, afraid the smoke or glow might draw attention. I built a hidden lookout point near the hills so I could watch the shoreline for any approaching boats. I even began digging a secret tunnel from my cave to a hidden exit in the jungle, in case I ever needed to escape unseen. Days turned into weeks. I saw no sign of the cannibals, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Then one evening, as I sat in my cave sharpening a spear, I heard it, a distant rhythmic drum beat. The sound sent chills down my spine. I had heard no such thing before. I rushed to my lookout point, peering down toward the beach. There they were. A group of men, perhaps 15 or 20, stood near the water. Some carried torches, their flames flickering in the night. Others held spears. In the center of the group, several figures were tied together. Prisoners. I could hardly breathe. My mind raced. What could I do? Should I help them? If I revealed myself, I would surely be outnumbered. But if I did nothing, these poor souls would die. I crouched in the shadows, watching in horror as the men dragged their prisoners toward the fire. They were preparing for a gruesome ritual, my hands clenched into fists. I could not let this happen. Taking a deep breath, I crept down the hillside, keeping to the trees. I gripped my musket tightly, my heart hammering in my chest. When I was close enough, I took aim at one of the warriors standing near the prisoners. The shot rang out through the night, echoing across the beach. The man collapsed, and chaos erupted. The cannibals shouted in panic, looking around wildly. I reloaded as fast as I could, but before I could fire again, the prisoners seized their chance. One of them, a tall and strong-looking man, broke free and fought back, knocking down one of his captors. I charged forward, waving my arms and shouting as loudly as I could. The remaining warriors, confused and terrified by the gunfire and sudden resistance, turned and fled into the jungle, disappearing into the darkness. Panting, I rushed to the surviving prisoner. He stared at me with wide, frightened eyes, unsure whether I was friend or foe. Slowly, I lowered my weapon and extended my hand. He hesitated, then took it. From that moment on, my life on the island changed forever. I had saved a man's life, and in return, he would become my greatest ally. I later learned his name, Friday. He spoke little English at first, but we found ways to communicate. I taught him words, and he taught me survival skills I had never imagined. He knew the island better than I did, showing me safer hunting grounds and hidden paths. For the first time in years, I was no longer alone, but we both knew one thing. Those men would return, and next time, they would be prepared. We had to be ready. From that day forward, Friday and I dedicated ourselves to fortifying our home. The island, once a place of solitude, had become a battleground. We knew the cannibals would return, and when they did, we needed to be ready. We started by strengthening our shelter. The walls of my original fort were sturdy, but they were not built to withstand a determined attack. We raised them higher, reinforced them with sharpened stakes, and created hidden escape routes. Friday showed me how to weave thick vines into barriers, making the walls stronger and harder to climb. We placed traps around our camp, sharpened sticks concealed beneath leaves and pits covered with branches. Weapons became our next focus. I had my musket, powder, and a few pistols, but ammunition was limited. Friday was already a skilled hunter, adept with a bow and spear. He crafted additional weapons, fashioning arrows with hardened tips and spears balanced for throwing. We made slings for stones, and I practiced my aim, determined to make every shot count. Despite the ever-present danger, life became more bearable. Friday's companionship changed everything. His cheerfulness lightened the long days, and he was eager to learn. He quickly picked up English, and I taught him new skills in return. Together we hunted wild goats and birds, fished in the shallow waters, and stored food for the coming months. Yet, no matter how much we prepared, a lingering sense of unease remained. We both knew the silence would not last forever. Then, one morning, as we stood on our lookout point, scanning the horizon as we often did, we saw it. Thick smoke rising from the distant shore. My stomach clenched. The cannibals had returned. We crouched low, watching carefully. Several canoes lined the beach, and dark figures moved around a fire. They were not alone. There were prisoners. My heart pounded as I counted the bound figures near the fire. Their fate was clear, and I could not bear to witness another massacre. Friday's face darkened with rage. He recognized some of the captives, his people. He turned to me, his eyes burning with determination. "We must fight," he said. I nodded. There was no other choice. We spent the next few hours making a plan. Unlike our first encounter, we had time to prepare. We moved through the jungle silently, using the trees as cover. careful not to disturb the undergrowth. Friday's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He guided us through hidden paths, allowing us to get close without being seen. We positioned ourselves on a rocky ridge overlooking the camp. Below, the cannibals laughed and jeered as they circled their prisoners. The sight filled me with fury. I tightened my grip on my musket and nodded to Friday. It was time. I took aim at the nearest warrior, steadying my breath. The musket kicked back against my shoulder as I fired. The man crumpled to the ground. The sound of the gunshot sent a wave of confusion through the camp. The cannibals shouted, looking around wildly. Before they could react, Friday loosed an arrow, striking another man in the chest. The prisoners, realizing what was happening, sprang into action. One of them, a tall and strong-looking man, broke free, knocking down one of his captors. Chaos erupted. I reloaded as fast as I could, firing again before charging forward. Friday was beside me, moving with incredible speed, his spear flashing in the firelight. The remaining warriors, caught off guard, hesitated for a moment too long. That hesitation cost them. The battle was over in minutes. Those who survived fled into the jungle, abandoning their canoes and weapons. Panting, I scanned the battlefield. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Then one of them, an older man with a weathered face, stepped forward. Friday gasped, "Father!" His voice broke with emotion as he ran to embrace the man. I watched as they held each other, their bond unbroken despite years of separation. Among the rescued prisoners was a Spaniard. He was weak but grateful. As we helped him to his feet, he spoke in halting English. "There are more," he said. "More men, my men, on another island." His words set a new plan in motion. This battle was over, but our fight was far from finished. We were no longer just two men surviving on a deserted island. We were warriors. We had allies. And now, we had a mission. Together, we would rescue the others. With the cannibals defeated, Friday's father and the Spaniard told us about a larger group of men who had been captured before. If we could rescue them, we could build a crew strong enough to escape the island. Over the next few months, we prepared a boat and gathered supplies. When the time was right, we set sail to the neighboring island. There, we found the Spaniards' companions, weak but alive. With our combined strength, we freed them and returned to our island. Now we had a small community. We worked together, improving our shelter and securing more food. The idea of leaving felt more real than ever. Then, something happened that changed everything. It was an ordinary day on the island, the sun hanging high in the sky, the waves gently lapping against the shore. I stood near the water, gazing at the endless horizon, lost in thought. Then something caught my eye, a speck in the distance, barely visible at first. My breath hitched as I squinted against the glare of the sun. A ship. My heart pounded in my chest. Could it be an English vessel? I grabbed Friday's arm and pointed. He followed my gaze, his eyes widening in surprise. For years I had dreamed of this moment, seeing a ship, the promise of rescue, the chance to return home. But something was wrong. As the vessel drew closer, I could see movement on deck, men shouting, a struggle. A group of sailors, armed with muskets and swords, pushed several men into a small boat, forcing them toward the shore. A mutiny. Fear and excitement warred within me. I had to be cautious. If these were traitors and pirates, approaching them could be dangerous. I turned to Friday. "We must hide and watch," I whispered. Together we retreated into the trees, crouching behind the dense foliage. The small boat reached the shore, and 3 men stumbled onto the sand. Their clothes were torn, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. But one of them stood out. His bearing was strong, his expression full of anger and determination. "The captain?" I murmured to Friday. The other 2 seemed to be his officers. Cast aside by their own crew, abandoned on an unknown shore, they looked defeated. But I saw something in the captain's eyes, a fire that had not yet been extinguished. That night, under the cover of darkness, Friday and I crept toward them. I stepped into the moonlight, my musket lowered, my hands open in a gesture of peace. The 3 men tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward makeshift weapons. "I mean no harm," I said softly. "I am an Englishman." The captain's eyes widened in shock. "Impossible," he whispered. I explained my story briefly, how I had been stranded here for decades, how Friday had become my friend and companion. The captain listened intently, then ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "My ship," he muttered, "has been taken. My own men betrayed me." His voice was filled with anger, but there was also hope. "If you wish to reclaim it," I said, "we can help." The plan was simple, but dangerous. Friday and I had fought before, but never against trained sailors. The captain assured me that some of the men aboard were still loyal to him. If we could retake the ship, they would fight by our side. The night was silent as we made our way to the beach. The mutineers were still aboard, unaware that danger lurked in the shadows. A small group had remained on shore, keeping watch over the boat. These we had to deal with first. Moving swiftly and silently, we attacked. Friday, a master of stealth, took down one guard with a swift strike of his club. I fired my musket, and the sound shattered the night. The remaining guards, startled and confused, barely had time to react before we overwhelmed them. Now it was time for the ship. The captain and his officers led the way, rowing quietly toward the vessel. The waves rocked the boat, and my pulse pounded in my ears. If we were discovered before we climbed aboard, all would be lost. We reached the hull, and one by one, we climbed up. The deck was dimly lit by lanterns. Some of the crew lay sleeping, unaware of the battle creeping toward them. The captain moved like a ghost, retrieving his pistol and sword from his former quarters. Then, all at once, the silence broke. A mutineer spotted us, shouting in alarm. The fight erupted in a storm of gunfire, steel, and chaos. Friday fought with fierce precision, his spear flashing in the dim light. The loyal crewmen, emboldened by our arrival, turned against the traitors. The battle was short but brutal. The mutineers, caught off guard, stood little chance against our combined forces. One by one, they surrendered or fell. Finally, the last shot rang out, and silence settled over the ship. The captain, breathing heavily, stepped forward. The remaining traitors knelt before him, bound and defeated. He looked down at them, then turned to me. "The ship is ours," he said. I barely heard him. My mind was racing. It was over. I was free. Standing on the deck of an English ship once more, I felt like I was in a dream. The sails billowed in the wind. the vast ocean stretching endlessly before us. The island, the place I had called home for 28 years, grew smaller and smaller on the horizon. Friday stood beside me, silent, his dark eyes watching the waves. "You do not have to come," I said gently. "This is my journey, not yours." He turned to me with a small smile. "I go where you go." A lump formed in my throat. We had become more than friends. We were brothers. I placed a hand on his shoulder, grateful beyond words. Days passed at sea, the journey smooth and swift. And then, one morning, I saw it. England. The towering cliffs, the familiar coastline. My homeland. My heart ached with longing and fear. So much had changed. What would I find? As we docked, the reality of the years I had lost hit me. My father was gone. My brothers had moved on with their lives. The world had moved forward without me. I was wealthy. My investments had flourished in my absence. But I felt like a stranger in my own country. The noise, the crowds, the endless streets. It was overwhelming. But I was not alone. Friday stood at my side, experiencing this strange new world with me. Together we navigated the unfamiliar streets, searching for a place in this society that no longer felt like home. For months, I tried to settle into a normal life, but something inside me had changed. I was no longer the young man who had once dreamed of adventure. I had lived it, survived it, and I could not simply stop. The world beyond England called to me. The unknown lands, the distant shores, the thrill of discovery. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I looked at Friday. "I cannot stay," I admitted. He smiled knowingly. "Then we go." And so, with gold in my pocket and the call of adventure in my heart, I set out once more. Not as a castaway, not as a prisoner of fate, but as a man who had conquered the wild, who had faced death and survived, a man ready for whatever lay ahead.